Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. I'm Daniel McAdams, the co-host. Dr. Paul is away again today. However, he will return tomorrow, so never fear. Today, I'm going to do something slightly different. I'm going to do kind of a briefing on Syria. I know we've covered Syria a lot over these months that we've been doing the show, but it continues to be such an important issue. I'm going to talk about just 3 important events that have happened within the last week or so that I think we need to pay attention to. And then I will give some concluding points. I'll give a recap, and I'll put those points up so we can look at them together. I will start by saying President Obama has just finished his final address to the UN General Assembly today. And of course, it was peppered with many things about American exceptionalism and this other, all of these similar things. But one thing was very interesting. He said, I don't think America can or should impose our system of government on other countries. That is great advice. If only the Obama administration had followed that, these 8 years of policy, we would not have had the disaster in Libya. We would not have the disaster in Syria, various countries in Africa. Iraq would be much better off if only he had followed this. But the ceasefire in Syria is the first point I'd like to make. It went into effect last Monday. So just over a week old. The first point about it is that the agreement was secret, which is unusual. The Russians pushed for the Americans to make it public, but the Americans insisted on the agreement being secret. That makes it very difficult to know who is living up to their obligations, whether the Russians are, the U.S. is, or whether they're not. So that is the first point. We do know that a key component, however, of the agreement was this, and it's a long-standing component. The problem is with the U.S.-backed forces, the so-called moderates in Syria. They have increasingly allied and intertwined themselves with Islamist terrorist forces, specifically the al-Qaeda franchise in Syria. And even the State Department has admitted, I think we've even shown a video, how they are fighting together. They're sharing weapons and they're fighting together. A key component, a key obligation for the U.S. was to finally tell these groups, you must separate yourselves from al-Qaeda if you want to be considered moderates and thus not bombed. That has not taken place. And we do know that's not taken place. And I think there's a quandary for the U.S. here because, as we've said in the show just last week, are there moderate forces in Syria? Are there U.S.-backed forces that are not seeking to create an intolerant terrorist-based state with a radical Islamist ideology? I think the U.S. is afraid of not having sufficient so-called moderates to carry this out, hence their hesitance to force them to separate. Well, the ceasefire never really took place because from the very beginning, one of the U.S. so-called moderate groups, U.S.-backed groups, refused to participate in it at all. So it was sort of doomed from the beginning. However, the next couple of events that I'm going to go over, I think, have probably put the final nail in this ceasefire's coffin. So just over the weekend, and many of you have heard of this, the U.S. government hit with F-16s and A-10 Warthogs, hit a Syrian army settlement in eastern Syria, a military base in eastern Syria. It was an isolated base in eastern Syria. It had been surrounded by ISIS forces for a couple of years now. The U.S. strike killed between 60 and 80 Syrian Arab army soldiers, Syrian government troops, who were engaged in fighting al-Qaeda, or ISIS, at the time. The attack on the troops and the materiel they were carrying allowed ISIS to take a strategic hilltop and thereby shutting down a very important airport in the region. That airport had been used to deliver humanitarian aid to the people that are also in that besieged area. The Russians then immediately called a UN Security Council meeting to get the United States to explain why does it seem as if you're acting as ISIS's air force? The U.S. said it was a mistake. We didn't know what we were doing. We didn't know it was a Syrian government troops. A lot of people have found that rather suspicious because ISIS generally does not gather in bases together like this, and the U.S. has never struck that part of Syria at all. And if it had been striking ISIS in the area, it would have been to the direct benefit of the Syrian government troops. And the U.S. has never taken an airstrike that would benefit the Syrian government. So I think there are a lot of questions. But so Russia called the UN Security Council meeting to get an explanation. And U.S. Ambassador to the UN, Samantha Power, who is known as a humanitarian cruise missile, that's her nickname because she loves using bombs for humanitarian purposes. But she had a very odd statement, a very odd video that she made at the UN Security Council that night. And I think we have it that we can cue it up and you can listen to what she had to say.
Vehicles. We are investigating the incident. If we determine that we did indeed strike Syrian military personnel, that was not our intention. And we, of course, regret loss of life. This said, a stunt replete with moralism and grandstanding, is uniquely cynical and hypocritical. Vehicles. We are investigating the incident.
And I think that's why you'll see that U.S. diplomacy is not very well respected in other countries. You know, you've just killed 60 to 80 troops fighting ISIS, and this is the best you can do as an apology to call the Russian move a stunt. It's pretty stunning. So the third of these three very important events happened just overnight, essentially. And this, you may be reading about it in the morning news. A humanitarian aid convoy in East Aleppo, which is held by al-Qaeda troops and is mostly abandoned, mostly evacuated. There are some people there, but it's under siege by al-Qaeda and has been for a number of years. That aid convoy was apparently attacked last night. What is interesting about the claims, the U.S. immediately claimed that Russia and Syria had attacked the aid convoy. It's unclear at this point who was behind the attack, whether it was an airstrike or whether it was a bomb or whether it was simply torched. But, of course, the U.S. immediately came out and blamed Russia and Syria without evidence. But they did have some evidence. They had video from a group called the White Helmets. They are billed as a humanitarian group. However, they have close ties with the Nusra Front in Syria, and they're also funded by the United States and the UK government. The US gives them $23 million a year, and the UK gives them $29 million a year. What's interesting is that the leader of this White Helmets group was denied a visa to enter the United States recently. So we're happy giving them money, but we're suspicious about having them on our soil. That was the first group that claimed it was an airstrike, although they had no video. And then there was reporting from the UK government-backed Syrian Observatory for Human Rights. This is a group that purports to give news on the ground in Syria, although it is based in the UK and doesn't have any assets on the ground in Syria. The Russians and Syrians have denied that they struck this humanitarian convoy from the air or that they attacked it at all. The Russians said they were following the convoy with a drone the entire time. When it reached its destination and was being offloaded, it stopped videoing, and at that point it was in the hands of the Nusra Front people in the region. We don't know the answer. We can only ask who benefits, cui bono. It certainly doesn't make sense to me that, first of all, when all eyes are on these aid convoys going into Aleppo, all eyes are on this because this is one of the things the U.S. said that the Russians and Syrians must do. They must allow humanitarian aid into Aleppo. So all eyes are on this convoy. It seems an insane time, if you want to prevent the convoy, to hit it with an airstrike when everyone is watching. I don't see how you think you could benefit by doing that, unless, you know, as the media says, they're just madmen. Putin and Assad are just madmen. They get off on killing people. If you accept that, then perhaps. The other thing, why would you let it get to its destination and while it's being unloaded, why would you strike it then? Why wouldn't you strike it before? Why would you prevent it from getting to its destination? So I think it's very, very murky. And I think the U.S. government knows that its claims are very, very murky. And I think that's why it's trying to be too clever by half in attributing the blame for this to the Russians without directly saying the Russians bombed the convoy. So here's what John Kirby, the State Department spokesman John Kirby said. The destination of this convoy was known to the Syrian regime and the Russian Federation. Yet these aid workers were killed in their attempt to provide relief to the Syrian people. That's a very interesting way of putting it. The implication is, of course, they knew where they were, so they attacked it. But it didn't really say that. Well, the U.S. also knew the destination. The rebels certainly knew the destination because they were there. If you ask who benefits, if that's the real question, then no one would benefit better than the Nusra Front, the al-Qaeda rebels who control eastern Aleppo, because they get a huge PR victory. They give a huge bloody nose to Russia and Syria, and they get this so-called ceasefire off the rails, so they can go back to their offensive in Aleppo, which they've actually begun simultaneous to the apparent attack on this humanitarian aid convoy. Al-Qaeda launched a new offensive against western Aleppo, which is controlled by the Syrian government. So, yes, it's a mess. But these things are important because of these events. The ceasefire is breaking down, although John Kerry and his Russian counterpart, Sergei Lavrov, are meeting today, I believe, in Geneva to discuss whether it can be salvaged. The ceasefire is breaking down. The U.S. is trying to blame the Russians. The Russians have claimed that the Americans have not lived up to their obligations. So I want to just have a recap of how we got to where we are and where we are. And if we can put it on the screen just as bullet points, it might make it easier. So shattered strategy, what is the end game for Syria? Let's rewind. The U.S. government claims it is in Syria to fight ISIS. It started attacks in 2014 on a false pretext. Remember that the Yazidis were trapped on a mountaintop and they needed to have American airstrikes to save them. Well, that turned out to not be true, but the U.S. didn't say, oops, we'll just go home now. They actually stayed. Rewinding to 2011, President Obama determined that Assad must go, and he authorized covert and overt actions to make that happen. The U.S. determination to oust Assad has led Washington ally with Islamist and sectarian militias and even indirectly with al-Qaeda. We've talked about the mixing of the so-called moderates with al-Qaeda in Syria. So with this in consideration, what is Washington's endgame? I think we can agree that U.S. policy in Syria makes no sense. And I think Washington realizes it. I think Washington understands it. And if we can just have that back on the screen, please. Washington does understand that it makes no sense. That's why Washington has even stopped talking about democracy or freedom. Its talk is all about ISIS, while its actions are all against Assad. I would say that the U.S. is still committed 100% to regime change. It's incapable of making a U-turn on a bad policy. It's committed to regime change in Syria. It wants Assad out. It will do anything to have that happen, even attacking Assad's troops. There is only one rational move for the U.S. at this point, and that is absolute disaster. We need to end support for rebels, pull out of Syria. It is not in our backyard. It's nowhere near the U.S. ISIS is not a threat to the United States unless we continue bombing them and killing people over in the Middle East and giving people the inspiration and the motivation to seek revenge. So let's hope that with the U.S. policy in tatters, some saner voices might prevail and the U.S. may finally admit that its policy in the Middle East is wrong-headed, bad, very expensive, and very dangerous for Americans who are forced to pay for it. I want to thank everyone for tuning in to the Liberty Report today, and I hope you will come back and see us tomorrow.